France. So for France I've decided to divide it into two. There's Free France and Vichy France, and in this case both Frances inherit, if you will, France's performance before they split into two. So France's performance proper really begins with the Saar offensive, which went nowhere. It's important to note that at this point pretty much everyone, including even in part the Germans, had a very World War I-esque view of the war, and it was not until the relatively quick victory over Poland, far quicker than what anyone expected, that the Germans didn't seriously begin to consider the possibility that the game had changed, and even then, there was a lot of bickering between the German officers. It's been speculated that had the French launched a serious offensive, the war may have very well ended here. After all, the Saar offensive put 40 French divisions against 22 German ones. However, it should be noted even with this very limited offensive, French casualties were roughly 3 times that of the Germans. France took part in the defense of Norway against the Germans, but it didn't send a particular amount of forces both in army and navy. So the next major campaign in which the French participated in was, well, the downfall of their own country. I already spoke about this regarding the Germans. This was mostly due to an error in thinking the war would go along the same way as World War I, and also that the German plan hinged on predicting the Allies would do exactly what they did the moment Belgium was invaded. Now, I'm not gonna lie about this. The fall of France, just by its overall significance and due to how quickly it happened, makes me consider F tier for France. You have to consider the expectations in this. One thing is Poland, or Norway, or Denmark, or Belgium, or the Netherlands. Another thing is France. It is entirely expectable Germany would be able to conquer those countries as they did. But France is a great power. Nobody expected France to fall, especially not in 6 weeks. Still, it's not like this is where French military involvement ended. The French did beat back an Italian invasion where they were significantly outnumbered, and in Africa, under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle, the troops of Free France by all accounts reportedly fought well. As for Vichy France, they weren't particularly involved in the war, and the only time where they fought was briefly in North Africa against the Allies, where they eventually lost. Ultimately, because there's 2 Frances in this war, each is going to get a slightly different score, with Free France barely managing to overturn the disaster that was the fall of France and managing to find itself in D tier, while Vichy France ultimately gets F. All the jokes made at the expense of France are getting a little sickening. By now, every time I hear them, my blood starts boiling. Hell, if I had to guess, your blood starts boiling too, but at least I get to chill out with YoursApp. YoursApp is a mindfulness application which has the stated goal of improving your mental and physical health by reducing stress and anxiety, whether that is through helping you sleep, meditate, stretching, giving advice, or even doing yoga. In my particular case, I use the app to meditate, as it has breathing clocks for days. By the way, the guided sessions are what I personally recommend you use. If you're new at meditating, which, let's face it, you probably are, you need guidance. Check out YoursApp using the link in the description below, or use the code SPECTRUM to save 60% off the yearly plan. Use YoursApp and perhaps you too will one day reach the enlightened conclusion that the Roman Empire was destined to fall and no tweak in the timeline was ever going to save it. And be fine with that. The Soviet Union. We finally get to the Soviet Union, ultimately one of the 2 major winners of World War II. Perhaps due to the fact the Soviets ultimately won the most important front, I assume a lot of people expect the Soviets to be in S tier, but, well, you're in for a major shock. For starters, I do think the Winter War is a part of the general conflict that was World War II, and even though the Soviets ultimately won that war, I am of the opinion it was kind of a humiliating victory. The Soviets struggled so much in that conflict largely due to poor leadership, planning, and overconfidence. The majority of the Soviet Union's war efforts, and for some people the entirety of it, is defined by the struggle against the Axis in the Eastern Front. Now, pretty much everything in this war is discussed to this day, and I do try not to take any opinion too strongly, but one which over time I tend to stick to more and more is the view which defends the Allied Lend-Lease was extremely important, if not absolutely crucial for Soviet victory. And ultimately this will be reflected on the tier list regarding some countries, especially the Soviet Union. But I suppose I should explain why I think the Lend-Lease was so important, seeing as there are different opinions on the matter, so here's why. Though Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky said the US only contributed about 4.8% of the Soviets' wartime production, Books on the Great Patriotic War assert the Lend-Lease wasn't important, and even the last head of government in the Soviet Union, Nikolai Ryzhkov, said the Lend-Lease didn't play an important role. All these statements directly contradict the words of those who actually lived through the time period, one of whom being Stalin himself. In his own words in the Tehran Conference of 1943, in order to bitch-slap some germs, we needed the stuff you make from your farms. Okay, actually what he said was, I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States is a country of machines. Without the use of these machines through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war. Now, this could be taken as an attempt by Stalin to get even more stuff from the Allies, but the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, who, by the way, shares the same view, tell that whenever they were discussing freely among themselves, Stalin had the same opinion. He stated bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov is of the same mind. Today, some say the Allies didn't really help us. But listen, one cannot deny that the Americans shipped over to us material, without which we could not have equipped our armies held in reserve or been able to continue the war. When perhaps the greatest military mind of the Soviets, the intermediary between political rulers and military, and the personification of the Soviet state itself are all on the same page about this, well, that's good enough for me. It can even be argued the British may have been a major help to the Soviet Union as well, as British Lend-Lease tanks composed 30 to 40% of medium and heavy Soviet tank strength defending Moscow by December of 1941. The Lend-Lease was extremely important to the Soviet front because A. it came at the right time for the Soviets to get back on their feet, and B. it covered one of the traditional weaknesses found all throughout Russian military history. It covered supply and logistics, a chronic problem in the Russian army. Without Allied weapons, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, and most important of all, trucks, the Soviets would have had a much harder time not just defending themselves, but launching prolonged offensives. The only time where we see the Soviets fighting without American Lend-Lease is in 1941. And 1941 was not a good year for the Soviet Union. In fact, that alone puts them firmly out of S tier. Still, the Soviets did win the war. They were the ones who effectively knocked the Axis at large out. They were the ones who did win what was, by a significant margin, the most important front, and reached Berlin. And that counts a lot. And for that reason, the Soviet Union still finds itself in A tier, though a bit at the lower end of the scale. Finland. Throughout World War II, Finland participated in 3 different conflicts: the Winter War, the Continuation War, and the Lapland War, the first 2 being against the Soviets and the last against the Germans. They ultimately lost the first 2 wars and won the third. Regardless, the Finnish performed admirably in, I would say, all 3 of them, especially when you consider the fact they were significantly outnumbered in all 3 wars. Kind of. Throughout the Continuation War, numbers fluctuated wildly, but the other 2 wars have the Finnish with the fewer numbers by a significant margin. Though ultimately losing both the Winter and Continuation War, the Finnish inflicted significantly more casualties than the Soviets. Against the Germans they also inflicted a greater number of casualties, but only by just a little. The Lapland War was fairly limited, so the number of casualties is pretty low on both sides. I'd say Finland performed fantastically during the war, and for a country of its size, there isn't much more you could realistically ask of them. High A tier, fairly close to S in fact. Denmark. A day was all it took. There isn't much more I could say. The F tier in this case is pretty obvious. Seriously, what else could I give? Norway. Now, I'm fully aware the Norwegian campaign went, for the most part, pretty swimmingly for Germany. I'll say there are more countries than just Denmark who were conquered by Germany getting F tier, but Norway isn't actually one of them. I'll be putting them in D tier. Luxembourg. Yes, Luxembourg went down pretty much without a fight, but unlike, say, Denmark, I don't think it's exactly fair to just straight up F tier them as, well, there isn't much Luxembourg could realistically do. Their position was comparable to playing Crusader Kings as a one-province count bordering the Holy Roman Empire. The HRE declares war on you and starts marching towards your province with tens of thousands of men, and all you can muster to defend yourself is 5 guys and a sheep. They'll be in the question mark tier instead. Belgium. I normally wouldn't consider how countries act before the war, but I do believe I have to open up an exception on Belgium, as The only time Belgium had a realistic chance of not getting conquered by Germany was before they were endowed. I'm of the opinion Belgium was just too passive. Though it's somewhat understandable Belgium was in a somewhat of a difficult position, the cold reality is everyone and their mother knew the Germans were going to invade France through Belgium. It may be too harsh, but I'm placing Belgium in F tier. The Netherlands. The Netherlands went out in a week. Though they lasted little time, it's important to note they were severely outnumbered. Honestly, I can't say the Dutch did poorly. They were caught slightly unaware in some areas of defense, but they put up a fierce resistance and even inflicted severe casualties, particularly on the Luftwaffe. Even against the Japanese, the Dutch were a significant headache, though they evidently lost that campaign as well. But I can't say the Dutch did poorly. I don't think they quite deserve the Finland treatment, but surely B tier isn't unreasonable. Italy. So the more I spent my time researching Italy in the war, the more disgusted I was, because I went into the making of this video with the mentality of, come on, they can't have been that bad, regarding the Italians. And, well, let's start with the positives. First, the Navy and Air Force overall didn't perform too badly throughout the war. They were actually pretty decent. Secondly, that's it. I can't really think of anything else. I suppose the very early stages of the North African campaign also went well, but overall the Italians just performed badly. The battle for the control of the Mediterranean was one front which I would say the Italians performed acceptably, but even in that front, just like pretty much every other front, the Italians were very much dependent on the Germans. The North African front was similar. The Italians struggled against the British and didn't begin seeing some success until Rommel arrived with reinforcements. It should be noted though, under Rommel the Italian rank and file performed a lot better than under Italian commanders. This was all without mentioning the Italian invasion of France or the Italian invasion of Greece, two pretty F-tier performances to put it mildly. So to be frank, Italy goes into D-tier, without much doubt in my judgment. Hungary. Hungary's participation in World War II is limited to two major campaigns, one against Yugoslavia, where admittedly they didn't do much except occupying Vojvodina, and one against the Soviets, which consumed most of their war efforts. In this regard, the Hungarian fate in this war was much like the German one, initially successful in helping the Germans in Ukraine, including at the Battle of Uman. As time wore on, Hungary's participation in the war became more and more pronounced. At the Battle of Stalingrad, the Hungarian Second Army suffered terrible losses. Further losses followed in the Battle of Voronezh, where the Hungarians were crushed, and after this the Hungarian army effectively ceased to be a fighting force. From this point onward, any involvement in the war by Hungary became a nightmare to the Hungarian populace, as the country was taken over before the Soviets arrived, reducing Hungary to a German puppet. The Hungarian army fought bravely against the Soviet invasion, but they were no match for the Soviet and Romanian forces, and eventually the Hungarians found themselves occupied. I'll say C tier. Romania. Romania gets high B tier, on the virtue of being Germany's most valuable ally. Yes, more than Italy. Not only because Romania sent more men to the Eastern Front than anybody, excluding Germany that is, but also because Romania's oil supply kept Germany's war efforts going through pretty much the entirety of the war. In this regard, Romanian war efforts go pretty much like the rest of the German allies on the Eastern Front. Initially successful and becomes increasingly disastrous as the war progresses. Eventually the war came to Romania and the fascist dictatorship which couped its way into power got couped themselves. So in case you're wondering, yes, they got away with it. Romania literally switched sides at the last possible moment, kind of like Italy, and so are technically part of the winners. Also, it may sound a bit silly, but as members of the Allies, the Romanian military record is actually pretty squeaky clean. I mean, it's mostly Soviet efforts, but still. Bulgaria. I tend to see Bulgaria as kind of an unwilling ally, which makes sense, because after all the German offer to Bulgaria was join us or die, and there really wasn't much Bulgaria could do. After joining the alliance, Bulgaria was, for the most part, pretty non-committal. They didn't participate in the invasion of Yugoslavia, didn't participate in the invasion of Greece, and didn't participate in Operation Barbarossa as well. I don't think I've ever seen such a war belligerent being this disinterested about the war they're technically a part in. I also don't really know if the end result of this war was a win for Bulgaria or not. On one hand, they actually gained territory, on the other, they became a communist dictatorship until 1990. Anyway, Bulgaria goes not in B or C tier, or not any other tier, but the question mark tier, on the virtue of being so thoroughly disinterested there's barely any action. Yugoslavia. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not particularly interested in discussing this part of the Balkans. There wasn't much Yugoslavia could have realistically done to fight against the Axis invasion. When you're invaded on all sides, odds are you're going to crumble under so much pressure. Still, under the leadership of Tito, Yugoslavia kind of liberated itself, so props there. I'd say C tier. Croatia. By the way, for the sake of clarity, I see Nedic's regime as an extension of Germany. The state was never internationally recognized and as such isn't on the list. As for the independent state of Croatia, well, I'm also not entirely sure if I should include it, as the current Croatian Republic does not recognize this state as a predecessor, considering it spent most of its efforts trying and failing to keep a hold of the country. F tier. Greece. Despite being inadequately supplied and suffering from Italian air superiority, the Greeks not only repelled the Italians, they actually began pushing deep into Albania, though with the benefit of hindsight, I question if this offensive wasn't too costly for the Greeks in both a logistical as well as a grand strategy sense, seeing as after struggling in Albania they felt compelled to ask the British for help, which made the Germans suddenly very interested in the Greek front. And so, despite what I consider to be an excellent performance from Greece in the initial phase of the war, the two blunders of first invading Albania and then asking the British for help sealed Greece's fate. Which is a shame, because had Greece been smarter about this, they could have ended up like Finland. As much as it pains me, C tier. Iran. Iran was the victim of an Anglo-Soviet invasion in World War II. The country surrendered after 6 days, which isn't surprising given A. This was a blatant act of aggression by the Allies, as they had not even bothered to declare war, and B. The Iranians were completely unprepared for a war, being possibly outnumbered and definitely lacking quality in both training and equipment in comparison with the Allies. D tier. The United States. Now, when dealing with the United States in World War II, throughout the years, I've become more and more of the opinion that American intervention was extremely important, and maybe even crucial, for the war to have come to an end in all major fronts, including the Eastern Front. I actually consider the US more important for the outcome of the war than the Soviet Union. I've already spoken about the Lend-Lease and what I think of its importance when I talked about the Soviets, but one thing I didn't mention was, this wasn't always my opinion. In fact, if you were to ask me which country was the most important for the outcome of World War II, say, a good 7, 8, or 9 years ago, I would just tell you the Soviet Union, and pretty much without much doubt in my mind, and that American entry merely sped up the end of the war. Now, I do have to say, I don't think the Americans were perfect in World War II. They do have their fair share of failures, especially tactically. Particularly in the Western Front, I don't think the Americans did particularly well, and that the difference in combat capability in comparison to the Germans was notable, especially whenever they faced veterans from the Eastern Front. Furthermore, I don't think the American generals were also tactically that good either. This includes Patton, by the way, whom I find to be massively overrated. Still, whenever I look at the big picture, it's difficult for me to ignore the fact that the Americans contributed a lot to this war, and I do mean a lot. They pretty much single-handedly dealt with one major front and were absolutely instrumental, if not absolutely necessary, in dealing with the other major two, as I don't think the Western Front would have even been opened without American presence. And once again, without Lend-Lease, I have no idea how the Eastern Front would go. I am of the opinion it was, at least, very important for the Soviets. So yeah, a country which dealt with one front, played a crucial role in another, and gave extremely important support for the other. I've debated myself whether or not the United States should be in A or S tier, and in the end I couldn't ignore what I perceived to be their impact, and so the Americans barely squeaked into S. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. It took a while to make. There may be signs of fatigue by the end, especially in the writing, as this project took me 4 weeks to do, and I hadn't put this much effort in a video in a while, maybe ever. Most of it was spent on research, and let's just say that after this, I'm not focusing on World War II in a while. If you aren't subscribed, well, it's just a little click, and you can always change your mind. This was Spectrum, and I'll see you around.